The Sea Peoples are one of history's great enigmas. They seemingly show up out of nowhere, wreak havoc, and then disappear as quickly as they showed up. Most models of the Sea Peoples, their origins, travels, and ultimate fate, start with close readings of the inscriptions and reliefs at the mortuary temple of Ramses III at Medinet Habu. Paired with archaeological work, most scholars will say the Sea Peoples likely originated in the Aegean. They were migrating from their homeland and had devastated Anatolia and Syria on their way to Egypt. They'll say that they were a novel threat to the powers of the ancient Mediterranean. However, recent research suggests this may not be the best interpretation of the Medinet Habu data. Some scholars are suggesting that maybe we need to rethink how we look at some of these data. Maybe we've missed some of what was being communicated. Maybe the Sea Peoples aren't from the Aegean at all. Maybe they weren't really migrating. Maybe the Egyptians already knew all about the Sea Peoples. And today we're going to try and look at the data through the eyes of ancient Egypt. Let's dig in. The University of Chicago has worked at Medinet Habu for nearly 100 years. They have published drawings of the reliefs and the inscriptions, which are available for free download on their website, and we put the link in the description below if you want to check them out for yourself, and we'll be using those drawings for most of our discussion. The temple itself was built by the pharaoh Ramses III as his mortuary temple. That is, a place where the cult of the deceased pharaoh could be maintained and the maintenance of the pharaoh's afterlife could be ensured. These temples are often depicted with the events and accomplishments of the life of the pharaoh, and so at Medinet Habu we have depictions of the major military campaigns of Ramses III depicted in reliefs. Particularly relevant to us are those on the north and west walls past the second pylon. On this wall are 13 scenes depicting the pharaoh Ramses III campaigning against Libya and then his campaigns against the Sea Peoples. Two reliefs have received most of the attention. The first is the so-called Battle of Jahi, where Ramses' forces are shown victorious over the feather-capped Sea Peoples who have ox-drawn carts filled with women and children in tow. The second battle, a sea battle, shows Egyptian forces defeating boats filled with various foes identified as groups of the Sea Peoples. These reliefs have been interpreted a variety of ways, but often scholars pore over them with the presumption that these are accurate reflections of history. These battles actually happened, and these reliefs accurately depict the events. However, other scholars have shifted to interpret these reliefs and the inscriptional evidence with them in light of their context, as Egyptian royal propaganda. These reliefs may reflect historical reality, but only inasmuch as it serves the larger rhetorical goal of the entire compound where we find these reliefs, namely the elevation of the pharaoh. And this larger goal could call on a long, rich literary and iconic history. That is to say, the scribes and artisans who worked at Medinet Habu worked to elevate the achievements of Ramses III by situating his works within a larger milieu of depictions of past victorious pharaohs. As a quick aside, this is not to say that the claims of victory here are not rooted in fact. Pharaohs generally did not invent claims of campaigns and victories out of whole cloth. They may stretch the truth, but complete fabrication is not common. So there's no reason to doubt that Ramses did in fact fight both the Libyans and a coalition of foreigners we call the Sea Peoples. One key to understanding the reliefs is that they are iconic. Egyptian artists were able to communicate a lot of information using icons, that is, consistent, repetitive imagery that would have immediately communicated important context to the viewer. For example, urban-dwelling Asiatics were often depicted with yellowish skin, beards, and often with bright-colored clothing. Libyans are also often bearded, but they usually have tattoos. Shasu, the rough equivalent of Bedouin, wear turbans. Nubians have dark skin, short curly hair, and are usually clean-shaven. Locations of campaigns can also be identified without using words by using background icons. Cedar trees for Lebanon, fortified cities for Syria, the exotic flora and fauna of Nubia. This further identified how civilized the Egyptians saw their enemies. The Libyans and the Nubians were not sophisticated urban dwellers like Egypt was, but Syrians and Hittites were. Now, one argument in favor of these reliefs being strong witnesses to historical events is the amount of novelty in these reliefs. Reed-capped and beardless warriors with round shields are not attested in Egyptian art before this. Because they do not fit into the iconic world, new conventions were used which were probably based in reality, and so the depictions of the sea peoples are probably accurate. But when we consider other elements of the Sea Peoples campaign within their iconic and rhetorical context, we find the Egyptian scribes drew on a large iconic vocabulary to communicate a fair bit about who they understood the Sea Peoples to be. For starters, the organization of the Sea Peoples in these reliefs is unusual. As a rule, Egyptian war reliefs show the enemy in disarray. They show the pharaoh's army triumphant, usually after the battle is over, and the enemy is fleeing. Here we do see the chaos of battle. However, the way some of the Sea People soldiers are depicted, in formation, duplicated on top of each other, is usually reserved for Egyptian soldiers, and is an iconic method of multiplication and organization. It represents a large, organized fighting force. This is typically not how the enemies of Egypt are depicted in the midst of battle. Additionally, the soldiers are described with the Egyptian term taher. This term has a pretty long history in Egyptian inscriptions. In the inscriptional evidence available to us, it first shows up in the records of Thutmose III in his campaigns to Syria, where he describes the soldiers of the city of Tunip as taher. This has led some Egyptologists to believe this is a loanword in Egyptian, and that it was originally a Hurrian or maybe Semitic military term. In the reliefs of Ramses II battle at Kadesh, we see taher soldiers, appearing iconically as Hittites, marching in formation on their way to battle. Post-dating the Medinet Habu reliefs, the term also appears on a stela belonging to a great one of the taher, or commander of the taher, of the Shardana stronghold. This term has traditionally been translated as foreign soldiers at Medinet Habu, but more recent interpretations suggest it refers to allied troops. As in the taher at Kadesh were the allies of the Hittites, and so were depicted iconically as Hittites because that is who they were fighting for despite not actually being Hittite. By the late 20th dynasty, these troops appear in the Egyptian army. The use of the term in the Medinet Habu reliefs may then imply the enemy of Egypt was identified as those who served as allies of the Hittites and their Syrian allies, like those employed by Tunip or those in the service of Muwatalli at Kadesh. At Medinet Habu, they are not allied with a great power, but fight as part of their own confederation, and so are given a new ethnic costume of the reed cap. The reliefs of the Kadesh battle show the taher warriors marching in formation, but also associated with ox-drawn carts. These carts only appear in battle reliefs at the Kadesh battle and at Medinet Habu, suggesting an iconic link between the two. Even more, the kind of ox that pulls the carts is the same, a humped zebu. The carts at Medinet Habu have women and children in them. In one case, we even see a woman lowering her child out of the cart. These have typically been taken as evidence for migration. The Sea Peoples were fleeing their own collapsing society with women and children in tow in search of greener pastures. However, Egyptian scribes were not typically interested in depicting migrating enemies, as it didn't serve their rhetorical purposes. They really just didn't care about the motivations of their enemies, only that they were forces of chaos opposing the pharaoh. These ox carts with civilians in them do share similarities with the iconic Syrian walled cities. Walled cities with Syrian-appearing civilians were a common iconic marker of Syria by the time of Ramses III. So women and children in battle scenes were not actually uncommon, but usually restricted to within the walls of a city. But here they're not in cities, but in carts. But because of the iconic nature of these reliefs, the carts with women and children would have signaled to the original audience a Syrian background for the conflict, and possibly also for the warriors involved. The lowering of the child out of the cart is even reminiscent of a Canaanite custom of sacrificing a child in times of crisis. So if these carts are iconic symbols of urban Syrian society, it is a further signal of the level of sophistication of the Sea Peoples. They are stylistically linked with the urban societies of Syria and Anatolia. Regarding the organization of the Sea Peoples, Ramses describes them as making a conspiracy in their isles. Ramses indicates this was a concerted and organized campaign against him which had already succeeded in Anatolia and Syria, something attested in other textual sources and archaeological excavations. The organized group set up camp in Amurru, a kingdom on the border of Egypt which had been subject to the Hittites since the 14th century. The lack of clear leadership in the inscriptional evidence has led some to suggest there was no organization. In fact, some think the reliefs, both of the land and sea battles, are more emblematic of ongoing skirmishes Ramses had to fend off on a more or less continual basis, which are here condensed into single episodes of final victory for rhetorical purposes. However, we may actually have depictions of the leaders of the Sea People Confederacy, maybe 2 of them. In the land battle relief, there is a Sea People warrior who stands more or less smack dab in the middle of the composition. While Egypt usually did not draw focus on the leaders of their enemies, only when they were in submission to the pharaoh, here we have a nameless figure standing in front of the larger-than-life pharaoh giving a gesture of submission or of honor. Given the prominence and central position in the composition, some Egyptologists believe this to be the leader of the Sea Peoples, perhaps a sort of commander-in-chief of the coalition. Elsewhere, there are frontally facing captives, which are increasingly recognized as the leader of the Sea Peoples, though they are in bondage. One has lion-shaped manacles, while another has fish-shaped. It's thus most likely we have 2 separate leaders depicted, maybe one from the sea battle and one from the land battle. In fact, we can tell from the composition that the 2 battles took place in 2 very distinct locations. The battle reliefs are separated by a depiction of the pharaoh on a lion hunt. This serves several functions, but one of them is to mark a change in direction or move from one locale to another within the narrative flow of the whole composition. This custom is fairly well recognized within the study of Egyptian art, and so we can be confident the land battle took place in one location, most likely in or around Amurru in southern Syria, and the sea battle elsewhere, likely in the delta. So with 2 separate encounters, it would be fitting that Pharaoh would capture 2 separate leaders and depict each of them humiliated and submitting to Pharaoh. The lion hunt scene plays another role though. It is the central composition, and fittingly the pharaoh is centered with a fallen lion before his chariot and another wounded and fleeing lion before him. There is a strong cosmological message within the entire sequence, reinforcing the pharaoh's success in overcoming the forces of chaos. In hunting scenes, particularly the lion hunt, which are relatively common in pharaonic art, the pharaoh demonstrates their ability to control chaotic forces. From this central relief, we move to the battle scenes on either side. The enemy is depicted as chaotic, while Pharaoh and his forces are ordered. Finally, the Pharaoh is shown victorious over the chaotic forces, as the Sea Peoples are led as prisoners to be branded and then presented to the gods. The historical events are conveyed in such a way as to emphasize a cosmological message. When we pull the evidence from the reliefs together, we see the Egyptians presenting the Sea Peoples as a real, organized, and recognized threat to the ordered realm of Egypt. Like the lion was the most ferocious animal in the natural realm, we see the Sea Peoples equated with the lion in the geopolitical realm. Though, importantly, they're still no match for the pharaoh. They were not a ragtag band of migrants who, over time, infiltrated into Egyptian territory and engaged in skirmishes with Egyptian forces. This is presented as a concerted campaign, planned and organized, perhaps under a singular leader despite a multiplicity of ethnic or tribal identifications. And the Sea Peoples are presented as Ramses III's chaotic enemies, a greater threat to his pharaonic order than the Libyans or the Nubians, and linked with the urban landscape of Syria and Anatolia. As Tahir warriors with ox carts in tow, the scribes are showing these are professional soldiers known from campaigns against Syrian kingdoms and known to be allies with the Hittites. Now, Egyptian art can be weird. It isn't always straightforward. It's steeped in millennia of royal propaganda and religious ideology. Interpreting it is not always easy or intuitive. While it's not usually analytic in the way we would like, it doesn't mean it's not historical. And this is not to say all the studies which do take these reliefs as literal and historical are all flawed or wrong, only that we need to appreciate our sources for what they are. And when we do, they speak sometimes in unexpected ways. If we can meet them on their own terms, there are a lot of mysteries these reliefs can help solve.